I'm Ilona Rac from the University of Ljubljana. I work at the Chair for Agricultural Economics, Policy and Law. And I will be presenting the Slovenian case study, which was around building an integrated vision using a combination of tools. I will turn off my camera in interest of internet stability. I hope you can hear me for the entire presentation and nothing goes wrong. The internet has been giving me a little bit of trouble lately. Next slide, please. Okay, so why did we have a need to prepare an integrated vision? So not only did we have the opportunity because the Tools4CAP project was running, but there was also an interest at the ministry level to initiate a more comprehensive, more inclusive discussion around the next CAP. Because as Anna mentioned, a very big problem regarding the siloed approach was detected, which always ended up in fragmented discussions and sticking to sectoral priorities. And we thought that the best way to address this is to build a shared evidence base around a broad set of issues. We were building mainly on the previous categorization of the specific objectives, which is still valid now, but will not be anymore under the NRPP. And we wanted to connect data resulting from monitoring. So mainly these were context indicators with strategic planning, so some scenario analysis and stakeholder dialogue, trying to link it into a coherent process. Next slide, please. So this was basically the idea. We tried to merge indicators and monitoring data with some scenario analysis around it, and finally connect with participatory vision building in order to build a shared vision. Next slide, please. So the methodology may sound clean, but it was more of a learning process, sort of build as you go. We had a lot of exchange with the ministry, with also additional outside experts. And initial discussions showed that first we need to build an idea of what it is that we're actually addressing. So we tried to be as broad as possible. So we took the food systems approach. And then we sort of categorized and structured the different issues that appear in this food system into a number of indicators. We collected over 90 indicators initially, and then built upon that using different national and also international, like Eurostat, data sets. Then we took whatever data there were available, looked at what the baseline scenario is if this data continues to behave the same way as it has been for however long we've been measuring. And then we also decided to not have an elaborate scenario analysis, but try to agree on what is a desirable future. So we only had one alternative scenario to the business as usual scenario. And then we went back to the stakeholders to discuss what would be an appropriate desired future state given the current data. Next slide, please. So when we were constructing this indicator, let's say policy monitoring tool, that's what we called it, there was a great deal of discussion about what do we have, what do we measure, what stable data sets do we have, how do we order these, because we have a lot of overlapping, conceptually overlapping data sets. Next slide, please. And we ended up with a short list of really key indicators, which also have a relatively reliable time series data that we could build on. And you may notice, so the first the first indicators are all from the economic. So as you move away from the economic towards the environmental, social, and the ACIS datasets, we have fewer and fewer indicators available, and essentially worse data and worse fragmentation across other institutions, obviously. Next slide, please. So this is basically what it looked like. We had about 150 graphs that looked like this. Basically building on the available data, what you can see the trend line, different indicators. This, for example, is utilized agricultural area for cohesion regions. And then not only did we look at the data, but we also, in exchange with the experts, tried to explain both the trends, the drivers, and how this affects societal goals. Also trying to look at possible trade-offs between different goals. Next slide, please. And in terms of the alternative scenarios, this was also expert-based. So you can see here, these are greenhouse gas emissions for Slovenia, which have a good time series data. We knew that we had been, so obviously the emissions have been dropping. And then we discussed with the experts, okay, what is realistically achievable by 2040? That was our time horizon. And what is obviously desirable. So here we already had a desirable trend. So downwards, but the discussions with the experts showed that we have already picked the low-hanging fruit when it comes to greenhouse gas emission reduction. So we cannot realistically expect to reduce emissions by much. So this is the other line, the thicker line. So the dots are the actual trend, and the other line is the, thank you, the desirable trend. And again, we did this for the key selected indicators. Next slide, please. So after we had this compilation of indicators, we had a number of public presentations during which we discussed these trends with the basically agricultural stakeholders, but also broader. The inclusion of stakeholders was broader than ever before. I think we had, so not only environmental NGOs, for example, but also so animal protection NGOs, I think, for example, also the Vegan Society. So it was really very broad. And we also made a point of building a comprehensive picture that also tried to look at trade-offs, not only individual areas. This was our goal. So more than being very specific and very detailed, we tried to instill this idea of this is a system and there will be trade-offs with the stakeholders. Next slide, please. So in the end, we used a systems description that was actually from another literature source, not our own. But this wasn't really as important as the fact that we had started sort of to push, if you will, this system kind of thinking based on a common evidence-based. And the dialogue between us, other experts, so the University of Ljubljana, other experts, and the administration was actually quite rich, quite fruitful. It increased transparency when discussing with stakeholders. In theory, it would have facilitated the discussion of trade-offs, but as we had that many indicators and not that much time, in the end, we didn't really discuss the trade-offs as deeply as one would have wished, but we did start thinking more in this systemic way, I think. And also for most stakeholders, especially those who had been, let's say, present at the table for a longer time as compared to the newcomers, the discussion was actually a lot more anchored in these facts. Obviously, they did cherry pick and they highlighted the facts that were in their favor, but it was still anchored in facts more than previously. Next slide, please. In terms of challenges, I think, as Anna put it before, we can have a very elaborate process and a very good tool, but still a big factor in the result is the actual politics of the process. So currently, the vision which was agreed, including the text. So within this stakeholder community, we agreed the text. And then it was put into further processes at the governmental level, and it still hasn't really seen the light of day. So it was sort of stopped, blocked at other ministerial levels, which just shows that I guess our process has to be even more inclusive, even more participatory. Even though we thought that it was quite good, apparently, it was still considered too agricultural in some areas, but that's fine because the process we think was actually very useful. The stakeholders learned a lot. The ministry learned a lot. We learned a lot. But there are always these practical problems that will invariably happen, I think. So regarding the data, maybe we can go to the next slide. I have some examples. There were obviously issues. For example, this is a graph that shows damages after extreme weather events, and you will see the big damage in 2023. So even though, for example, we have a good time series of data, then you will have something like this happen, and it will completely throw off your trends. Obviously, here you can't actually build a good trend based on something like this. So this will happen, I think, especially with climate change. I think if we wait a few years, probably we will have more realistic data. But for example, this was one issue that we encountered. Next slide, please. Then another one was, for example, we only had short time series or few data points. And again, trying to build some sort of trend based on 3 data points, you will probably know is not exactly great, not desirable. Next slide, please. Then there were some areas, some issues where we didn't actually have any timeline series, just point data for individual years or only 1 year. But this was also something that we included because it's some data which is better than no data. And basically we hope that in the future collecting this data will be more organized. Next slide, please. So in terms of what can be transferred, I think what we really learned is that actually this was, from a data point of view, relatively simple, right? Both looking at the trends, collecting the basic data, looking at very simplified what do we want in the future and what is realistic based on expert discussions. This is not very elaborate. But it does enable dialogue with the strategic partners, I think. So in a way, it can be lightweight, but it can enable, especially, for example, stakeholders who are not as, let's say, data savvy or literate from a data point of view. It can actually enable a discussion among stakeholders like that better, especially also if you build like graphs, which are visually a lot more intuitively understandable than just data sets and tables. So this was good. But what you need for such a process, and we were lucky to have it, at least initially, is this policy demand. I think this is actually very important. If you have so somebody at the ministerial side who is willing to push the process, who is willing to discuss with stakeholders, I think such a process can be quite successful. On the other hand, if you don't, it will just end up being an exercise for its own sake. You do need some analytical capacity, which doesn't necessarily have to be in the ministry, obviously, but somebody does have to work with the data. So in this case, it was a combination of us and the Agricultural Institute. And we were also lucky to have the Agricultural Institute on board because they provided the access to the data, in addition to what the ministry has. Next slide, please. It's not moving. Okay. So in terms of the post-2027 CAP, one of the first things that we learned in our focus group was that, as Anna also indicated, the Commission seems to be quite keen on building on FADN or FSDN data for this round of CAP discussions. And essentially, this was the first thing that we saw, and also I see somebody put it in the chat. This is not enough, right? It's not only not enough, but it cannot give a realistic image of everything that is going on in a country. In Slovenia, for example, we know that, let's say, the FADN system could be improved in terms of sampling and so on, and data collection and reliability and so on. So it's obvious that multiple data sources must be combined. But also that's more than just the tools that we use, how you organize the process, how your governance processes run matters just as much. Regarding the analytical tools, it's obviously necessary to use them at all stages of the policy cycle, not just at the beginning. And the tools that you will be using will be different, I think. And regarding the planning process, what was obvious to us was that the ministry wanted to have like a head start before the formal negotiations start at the relation between the ministry and DG Agri. So they really wanted to be ready in a way. And that is also, I think, where the data comes into play, because you want to show with actual data to the Commission that you have actually thought it through and that your priorities are grounded in reality. Next slide, please. So I think I'm actually a little bit over time already. So I've indicated that the tools actually may not be as important as the ability and the willingness of the institutions to actually run the process, to acquire and organize the data and so on. So I'll just leave it with this final thought that it's not just tools that improve policy making, but it's the institutions. Thank you.